meeting of the Druid Grove of Anu in Killarney, Ireland. The Grove of Anu is a Druid Grove, member of the Order of Bards, Ovids and Druids. And we are, although we are an Irish grove, we're also an international grove because most of our activities are online. And every month we get together for a meeting. And this one is a special one for us because we have a special guest, which is Ben Stimpson. He's going to do an introduction on ancestral veneration, which will last for about an hour. And it will be streamed live on Facebook and YouTube. And here for the Grove members, we're on Zoom together. So I'll hand over the gavel, give the word to Ben. Ben, you can go ahead and start there. And good luck, and talk to you in a while.
Thank you so much, Jan. Thank you so much. I'd like to begin by, first of all, saying to the Grove of Anu and to everybody who is watching this subsequently, Gia Gwich. I hope that I pronounced that correctly. My name is Ben Stimpson. Today we're going to be exploring ancestral veneration. Part of this comes from the work that I've dedicated my life to in the past 2.5 years. My book, Ancestral Whispers, which is going to be coming out in September. I'll be telling you more about that later on. But for right now, I would like us to begin by settling into this space. I have 2 meditations we're going to be doing. One is about the ancestors, but for right now, I'd like you to join me in the Druid's Prayer. So if everyone can find their comfort space and plant their feet firmly on the ground. Grant us, O Great Spirit, by protection. And in protection, strength. And in strength, understanding. And in understanding, knowledge. And in knowledge, the knowledge of justice. And in the knowledge of justice, the love of it. And in that love, the love of all existences. And in the love of all existences, the love of all, our mother, our father, our ancestors, and all goodness. And I'd like to welcome you to this space today as we talk about the ancestors, but not just the ancestors that we think of. I'm going to hopefully try to expand that idea of ancestor for you and give you the reins to explore that word for yourself. So let me just share my screen here. So I do have a presentation with some slides, and I hope everyone can see that. Is that coming through? Yes, perfect. Okay. I'm just going to close that. Hide the video panel. There we go. And hide the float. It's perfect. So I actually can't see you right now. If there are any questions as we go through, there will be a time at the end for us to go through them. And certainly, if you want to put them into the chat as we go through, I'll quickly go through them afterwards. But I'd like to welcome you to this space today, the Grove of Anu presentation. If any of you are on the large OBOD Facebook group, you may have seen me posting information about my book and work and other information. And I was very, very, very pleased and honored that Jan and Karen reached out to me to do this presentation today. So a little bit about me then. So I am actually originally from North Wales. My parents are English, and we have both Irish, Scottish, English, and Welsh background. When I was 8 years old, I moved to Canada, and I have lived over here in Ontario, close to Toronto, for the past 28 years. I am actually in the process of moving back to the UK next year, hopefully, if all things go well. But a little bit about me here. I'm a therapist, I'm a lecturer, a student, and a spiritual director. I've developed courses on a variety of topics, including ancestral veneration, the power of story, and folklore. I've been a member of OBOD since about 2017, and I'm still working through the Bardic grade. as well as connections with other traditions. When I don't work with clients or when I'm not writing, I'm actually engaged with completing a Bachelor of Liberal Studies with a focus on religious studies, medieval studies, classical studies, and folklore. And I hope to pursue a Master's in Folklore in England in the next couple of years. You can learn more about me at benstimpson.com. And some of my spiritual background then. So I joined OBOD in 2018. That connection was really because of my British and Irish heritage, and working with the stories of my background was really important to me. Up until that point, I had connections with Hinduism. For a few years, I was connected with the Lukumi tradition, which is the tradition of the Afro-Cuban Orisha tradition, often called Santeria. And in that tradition, I really connected with ancestor and ancestral work. And this work that I'm doing now really flows out of that and really married with my Druidic work. So that's a little bit about me. I'd like to start then with a meditation, another meditation. So I'd like you to firmly plant your feet or ground yourself in any way you ground yourself into the earth again. And I want you to take some deep breaths with me. We'll start by bringing in the ancestors. So take a big, deep breath in and hold it and exhale. And experience, whether that be imagining or through other means, that you find yourself in your sacred grove, that you find yourself in that space, that landscape of spirit. And traversing that inner landscape, I want you to imagine or experience in whichever way you can, before you a giant tree. Whatever type of tree that you resonate with, the form of a tree that comes to you. Imagine its multiple branches branching out into the universe, into the sky. Imagine the shade that it is casting as its large canopy reaches out. And I want you to experience the trunk of that tree, massive, otherworldly. Now gently sink your roots into the earth, into the same earth as that great tree. Feel your root moving down and intermingling with that great tree. Feel yourself a part of that system underneath, that euphonic system underneath the earth. Bringing your attention up into the canopy of that great tree, become aware of the many branches branching out. Each branch, form of ancestry. Every limb, part of a great story. And with your roots intermingled among the roots of this great tree of life, become aware of the fruits hanging in this great tree. Become aware that some of them, the skulls of your ancestors, and some of them, the seeds of the descendants. In this space, this sacred grove, next to this great tree of life and death, feel yourself plugged into, experience yourself plugged into that great tree, great story that great world and all of the interconnection. And be here now with the ancestors. Be here now with the descendants. And be here now with all of the other beings that live in this great world tree. And taking a deep breath, feel your roots coming back up into you. Feel your awareness come back to your body. Taking another deep breath in. Back to this space. When you're ready, we will continue. Okay. So now that we have, and that is a gift for you, that is a space that you can go to anytime you want. That meditation appears in my book. And that is a meditation that I found particularly powerful for connecting with ancestors. So do feel free to take that with you and use that however way you wish. What are we talking about today? What are we focused on today? So today it's an introduction to the ancestral veneration. We're going to be speaking about what exactly is ancestor veneration. I'm just going to pull us out of here first. There we go, so I can see the timing. What is ancestor veneration? How is it seen around the world? What are some of its major components? How does it differ from other forms of spirituality and other forms of religious practice? What are some of the major beliefs? What are some of the pieces that differentiate or define ancestor veneration? The worldviews that are connected to it. And then we're going to discuss the various types of ancestors. And I'll talk about some of the pitfalls that we find ourselves in a Western society, how we conceptualize ancestor and how that can sometimes limit us. We're going to talk about the individual experience of ancestor veneration and also the social experience. And because we are all, or mostly all, Druids here, I want to bring us to that place of land, sea, and sky. I want to talk about these massive parts of our world and our existences in a framing of it as an ancestor. I want to expand that concept of ancestor and present you with the option or the food for thought of how a relationship could be like with the land as ancestor. So what exactly is ancestor veneration? I'm just going to take a quick break. I feel like as I was writing my book and as I was exploring this for myself, I realized that I benefited a lot from having been in a tradition where ancestor veneration was such a foundational, important part of the tradition. And I feel like most traditions around the world, of what I've seen, most traditions around the world have ancestral work and ancestor practice as a parallel practice and as an integral practice to the culture. I feel like in the West, we are still just developing this for ourselves. Nobody's really talking about, or if we do talk about this, there can be a little discomfort with that. And there's reasons for that. We'll talk about that later on, but there's reasons for that. So when we're talking about ancestor veneration in this presentation, this is really what we're talking about. And this is from a cross-cultural analysis piece here. So ancestor veneration from around the world, it is focused on ancestors as opposed to deities. Although, as we'll come to, we're going to problematize that distinction between ancestor and deity. Oftentimes, ancestor veneration traditions lie in parallel to dominant religious traditions, also called state religions or official religions. And you often find them either just underneath the surface or acting as a folk religion, as a folk religious tradition. And when I mean folk religious tradition, I mean localized, highly localized, often based in that landscape as opposed to being connected somewhere else, and often very domestic and familial, which totally makes sense because ancestors are domestic and familial. As I said, it tends to be very highly localized and tribal-based or community-based. You know, in various parts of the world, the ancestor work that is going on in this village is different from over here in this village because it incorporates the lived experience of those places. And so you see a lot more variety when it comes to ancestor work and ancestral tradition. Even within the same culture, you see a lot of variety, a lot more variety than you would if you were to look only at a religious point of view. So with official religions or large dominant state religions like Christianity or Buddhism, because Buddhism is kind of a parallel example in Asia of Christianity in the East, you often see then ancestor work is just underneath the surface, tends to be a lot more syncretic, and it incorporates the worldview of the overall arching religion, while also being highly localized. Ancestor work, as opposed to how it's often thought about in the West, is far more ritualistic in nature than philosophical. Ancestor veneration and other forms of folk religion is about what you do instead of how you think. It has nothing to do with belief because you're working with beings who were once alive. And so there's no belief doesn't necessarily come into it. Worldview comes into it, though, and worldview and belief informs the practice. But oftentimes, this is much more about what you do. Focus is on ritual and orthopraxy versus orthodoxy. The scope of what constitutes an ancestor is often broad, and we'll talk about and we'll explore that in the next slides. I feel like in the West, well, I don't just feel like, I know that in the West, we often culturally tend to think of ancestors as being blood relatives. And then that causes issues and questions like, what if I'm adopted and I don't know my blood relatives? Can I still work with the ancestors? That is a very particular cultural worldview. If you move yourself out of that cultural worldview and just take a step back, you see in many other cultures that those questions don't come into it. Those questions are irrelevant because the understanding of the community and the understanding of the family and relationship is different. So I feel like that also needs to be said here, that just like any other form of spirituality, ancestor work is highly dependent and highly built off of cultural understanding and worldview. And even that, the idea of what constitutes an ancestor is often very broad in different cultures around the world. And again, we'll come to talk about that and expand on that. I think the most important thing, and we'll expand on this in a moment, to understand about ancestor work is that it is not about death, it's about life. And that might seem like a misnomer, but it's the focus. So oftentimes in religions across the world, we have funerary and mourning rituals and practices. Those are about preparing a dead person to in their transition to the afterlife, wherever that might be. The mourning process and mourning rituals are about helping society cope with the sudden change or loss of an individual, and really not filling that void, but adapting and changing the culture so that that void is not felt as badly. So with ancestor veneration, though, the focus isn't on the fact that the person is dead. People are dead, or the ancestor is dead. The focus is on life. How then does that ancestor relate to the world now? How do they relate to the world of the living in their changed state? And so oftentimes the rituals are encompassing of that understanding that the dead are just different. They're changed now, but they're not gone. Most ancestor veneration traditions I've experienced tend to then understand that the dead are very present, they're just different. And so the veneration practice is really a form of communication. It's a way of relating to those spirits in their changed form. So it is about life. The focus is on then how does that relate to life? And it isn't about loss and grief. Grief and loss does come into it. That's a very human thing. But again, that focus is not on the fact that they've died. The focus is on them now as a changed individual. And I think this is also worthy to be said that because I think like in the Western world, we, from a spiritual standpoint and cultural standpoint, we tend to be very insulated from the rest of the world. Ancestor veneration is actually a norm around the planet. It is a normal part of most cultures that I have seen and noticed. You can find ancestor veneration on all continents. Antarctica. Penguins are not. Well, actually, I can't even say that. Maybe penguins do venerate their ancestors. We don't know, but most human-inhabited continents have ancestor work as part of their culture, and all of these other attributes here that it's a parallel tradition is and it's just in the Western world, because we have a very strange cultural connection with death and relationship with death. And really in the past 100 years, that has changed. We don't have a connection with many of the rituals that culturally we would have. I think also it's worth noting that I think in the neo-pagan world and community, there's a bias against Christianity, particularly partly because of religious trauma, partly because of other reasons. But you see ancestor veneration practices thriving even in Christian cultures. You just have to know what to look for. In South America, even in the most Catholic countries of South America, ancestor veneration is happening all the time. It's just knowing how to look for it and knowing how to conceptualize it. In Buddhism, which is really, that's the missionary tradition of Asia. Even in Buddhism, underneath Buddhism, in all of those different cultures, you have continuation of ancestor and pre-Buddhist ancestor and spiritual traditions going on. And oftentimes priests in Catholicism say very similar things to monks in Buddhism about not allowing ancestor work to continue, and yet they thrive in both traditions. So I think that needs to be said, that needs to be understood. That will come into our conversation later on. So what we have here, I just want to point out this beautiful shrine here. This here is a Vietnamese ancestor shrine. You can see here that you have various Mahayana and Chinese deities around here. And also just down here, unfortunately, I couldn't find it, but just underneath, you would have also images of the ancestors. And so you have the offerings, you have the enshrinement of the ancestors. And interestingly, connected to that, so you often find that Buddhism becomes in some cultures anyways, becomes the vehicle for ancestor work. So in Japan, for example, if you go to a traditional Japanese home, or even just a regular Japanese home, you will often find multiple shrines because Japanese society is pluralistic. There are multiple traditions in parallel. You will often find a Shinto shrine, a Buddhist shrine, and often incorporated into the Buddhist shrine is also the ancestor shrine, because the understanding that are different, they're genius loci, the spirits of nature, and so as beings and human beings, it's inappropriate to enshrine human spirits in that space, because that's supposed to be for kami. So Buddhism becomes then the vehicle for many ancestor veneration practices within kind of a Japanese Buddhist point of view. You don't tend to find that in houses where the people are not Buddhist, where they're just purely either secular Japanese with a Shinto shrine, or they just practice Japanese folk tradition. So there's multiple different pieces to that, but I thought that was an interesting piece that shows that connection between religion and ancestor work. So then let's go a little bit deeper into then worldview. What is the impact and what is the origins and the traditions that make ancestor veneration and define it in most traditions? This is a generalized sweep. There are some traditions, I'm sure, that will not have some of these components, but the majority of them have these components. So the first major belief that we find around the world in ancestor veneration is the understanding that the ancestors have a direct impact on the world of the living, that they can be communicated with directly, sometimes indirectly, depending on the tradition. Now, this one in particular, I'm not. I doubt that many people in Ireland will find this as a strange thing because of the Catholic heritage there. This is essentially the same worldview as saints. So when one venerates in a Catholic sense the saints, we're asking the saint to on our behalf to God in order to bless us, to impact the world. That is the same relationship, but understood in terms of ancestor around the world. We are venerating the ancestors in the hopes that they will then they will grant us or intercede for us or bless us in some way, because their state as a dead individual, because they've moved on into a different spiritual state of being. They now have expanded ability to impact the world in different ways than they would if they were living. And so the impact then is that they have that impact in the world. And so you see this recurring again and again, regardless of the continent, of this idea that the state of death gives power, and that has to be sometimes controlled, sometimes that has to be appeased, sometimes that can be propitiated. But there's multiple different cultures around the world, and big cultures too, that this belief comes into. On a social level, and this is where the power of story comes in. And the reason why ancestor veneration is so localized and so specific to communities and the tribe, really, is because it often, as a parallel system and a folk tradition, is often the container for a local community identity. It is the way that oftentimes many aspects of community culture are connected. So community identity is connected to this process of venerating the ancestors, working with the ancestors. And the practices, the praxis that, and the meeting point that then the whole community can come. This is a very similar process to other forms of folk tradition and folk practice. And this is why it is so localized, because I believe biologically and cognitively, we have a limit of how far we can conceptualize without it becoming too abstract. And so smaller communities where people grew up with each other, knew each other, and interact with each other, that share the same local culture. This is often where we find then folk religion, where the overarching religion, the state-sponsored religion, will generate localized customs that fit the needs of those individual communities. And so then we find a continuum of practice. Practices may show up in multiple different regions in a different way, depending upon those regions' needs. And what that does is, again, that creates that praxis, but also that container for all sorts of other aspects of community identity. And as a result, also personal identity. The vast majority of cultures in the world are collectivist in nature. Individualism, Western individualism, think really came about because of Protestantism and that kind of Protestant mindset of nothing in between you and God. That idea of the focus being on the individual and the individual strength and whatnot, especially what we find in North America, American individualism and exceptionalism, that piece is actually an outlier for the majority of the world's cultures, which are essentially collectivist in nature. And so personal identity in collectivist cultures tends to be highly connected in with group identity. Group informs the individual of who they are, and then the individual reciprocates that back. And so in this way, then, ancestor veneration is just a much larger continuum of that group. Right? The practices of the ancestors is what the living practice is, what then the individual practices. And then when the individual eventually becomes more important or gains traction and more authority in that community, the responsibility falls on them to continue those practices and change them also, because each generation changes as well. So as generations change, as individuals are informed both by the culture but also their individual experiences, then the culture changes. So then we find ancestor work becomes a common thread in the same way that religion and other forms of culture become common threads individuals to connect. And so then they're connecting with and practicing the same things, or what they perceive to be the same things as, their great-great-great-grandparents. Even if those things have changed, there is enough of a continuum that, we often find this with cooking, for example. You're cooking a recipe that your great-great-grandmother used to make. Right? You're tasting that recipe, even if it's changed slightly, it's an experience, and it's an experience that is going to link you with that individual. You're going to be experiencing something that they also experienced. And so then that binds and connects you together. So that's why we often find folk tradition in general tends to be a very communally thing. And a communal thing, and is often passed down within the family. I think that's also the other piece to this, is that, and this ties into then tradition, is that ancestor work is often in collectivist cultures passed down within the family. It becomes a natural part of the family. Often become a chore in the family, right? We've just cooked this meal. Okay, little girl, little boy, child, go and give this to the ancestors. Did you say your prayers? Did you brush your teeth? Yes. Okay, good. It's a way of then, again, locating individuals within a much broader social context, which includes the dead members of the society. One of my favorite movies is Coco. That's one of the movies that really inspired me with writing this book. And at the very end of that movie, if you haven't seen the the Pixar movie Coco, I highly recommend it. It's about the Day of the Dead, the Mexican Day of the Dead, and an individual little boy named Miguel who finds himself suddenly on the other side of the veil during the time of the Day of the Dead, and he meets all of his ancestors. And he meets all of these great-great-grandparents whose stories are still very much present in the family, and whose laws and rules are still very much in the family. And at the very end, the beautiful scene of the family celebrating the Day of the Dead, and then all of the spirits of the other ancestors are there. So it's a community thing. It's beautiful. So that piece about tradition, and as we know, working in some of the traditions that we practice, tradition is so important, not only because of it binding the community together, but it also helps us to inform out who we are and ourselves. There is something inexplicable about practicing something that our forebears also practiced. We become part of a much greater thing. Okay. And I do see something in the chat. I can't open it up though, so I will get to that when we finish. So then, that being said, then let's talk about then the ancestors. I devote 2 whole chapters to this in my book. I devote two chapters to something which I think a lot of people might take for granted as being, oh, well, the ancestors. Well, you know, it's an easy answer. The dead people who generated us, right? They're our forebears. They're the people, they're our parents, our great-grandparents, and so on and so on. When you look around the world, that concept of ancestor begins to shift and change. And I would posit that ancestor and how we understand ancestor is highly cultural. And because of that, I think that, as I said before, our Western culture and the limitations that our definition of ancestor has created a lot of issues for us. And so I want to challenge for you today what the concept of ancestor could be. So obviously, we have this idea of blood relatives. Now, that seems like it would be, you know, a normal, understandable thing. That's the definition of ancestor. Something that erupted when I was practicing Lukumi. When I was chatting with my godfather, and in Lukumi, the way that tradition is passed down is in family structure, right? My godfather teaches me and informs me about the tradition, and acts as a spiritual parent in that way. And we were talking about ancestor work and how kind of who you call to when you practice these practices, which includes rituals of placing down food, honoring and saying prayers, and thinking about them and communicating with them through divination. I said we somehow got onto a conversation about you know, if some Olorishas, the priests of this tradition, if they will look to only blood relatives, or if adopted relatives are also part of it. And he said that that multiple different priests have different opinions on this, depending upon what community they come from. So there's a different relationship with individuals when you're related to them by blood. But what I've come to understand for myself is that ancestor is anything I have a relationship with that has impacted me or added to who I am. So obviously, with blood relatives, those ancestors of blood, I exist in this body because this body was created by my parents, who were created by their parents, who were created by their parents, and so on. Now, that is a very direct physical, biological relation. But then if we think about relationship then in other ways, we bring in these ideas of adopted or lineage relatives. And this is one of the major questions I always get. What if you're adopted and you don't know who your biological relatives are? So there's answers to that. We'll get to that in a little while. But then if we look at it from a relationship standpoint of, you know, any being that has contributed to who you are, then that really exponentially expands this possibility of ancestors. So then we have ancestors by group or professional affinity. Now, I don't know who we have in our chat today, and who might be watching this, but if any of you belong to any kind of a lineage, whether it be a spiritual lineage, whether it be a professional lineage, whatever the case may be, all of those individuals that came before you that have handed down something to you and that you now stand in that place of lineage with them, they are your ancestors. Any individual of a group or professional background, we can look to particular individuals, and this often happens around the world, particularly with South American tradition, where particularly adept or powerful members of a group are then seen as ancestral. They stand as figureheads, they stand as placeholders for then the whole collective. So a good example for OBOD. So we have, of course, Russ Nichols, who was a founder of OBOD. In that line then of transmission of tradition, we also have individuals like, at least in Welsh tradition, Iolo Morgannwg, right? who really created a lot of the pieces. The prayer that we spoke at the beginning, the Druid's prayer, is one of his, right? And if we were to take that back even further, if we were to look at the power of story, and then when working with story, right, we have figures like, for in the English case, we have William Shakespeare, T. Crofton Croker, William Yeats, Sir Walter Scott. Any of these big figures of literature and storytelling can become ancestral, and they are ancestral, right? If we look at, say, professional affinities, right? If you're a nurse and practice the modern profession of nursing, then Florence Nightingale, right, or any of the other major founders of nursing in the world, right? And so then we start to see people who are not, or individuals who are not directly related to us, but we are connected to them through the relationship and their presence within whatever organizational group that we belong to impacts us as part of that group, right? So then how do we work with those types of ancestors? Do we see them as ancestral to us? Are they not ancestral to us? Are they some other form of category, right? This is all really playing games with the idea of how are we categorizing different forms of relationship. But it's worthy to note, right? The first one up here, ancestors as gods. But we don't tend to think of ancestors in the same scope as deities because of that Christian Western background. I think most of our cultures come from. Again, I'm not making any generalizations about who's listening to this here, but I would assume that most of us come from a Western cultural context, in which case then Christianity is really the overarching dominant tradition of that. And so we are trained to see God, the Father, as not being ancestor because he's God the Father, he's creator of all, he's in a different category. But if we look at other traditions, if we look at pagan traditions, if we look at other traditions around the world, the differentiation between a deity or a spirit and an ancestor is not as closely cut. I think of the Australian Aboriginal traditions, who see their dreamtime spirits as being ancestral to all of the beings in the universe. It's a very animistic approach of relationship. Even in the sense of, say, in the Irish context, the Dagda, the All-Father, right? Or in the Norse tradition, Odin as the Allfather, right? Jupiter, Zeus, all of these, while they may not necessarily have literally come into our parents' bedrooms, impregnated our mums and produced us, on a social level and a religious level, as forefather level, mythological space, they stand in that place of being the All-Father. And this ties into what we'll talk about with the sky later on, right? In a similar way, All-Mother, right? That idea of the land as a mother. If we often see those in conceptualized as deities and goddesses, we don't tend to think of them as ancestors because of that cultural training. So really, this whole exercise is really about challenging you to, in some ways, decolonize your thinking in order to begin to think about alternative ways. And I apologize if this is not new to anyone listening to this, but for me, changing my way of relating, or changing even how I conceptualized that relationship, really was a big thing for me. You often find on the fifth one here, ancestor is founder or mother of a group. You often find this in the traditions of European house spirits. So the ancient Romans, they had their lares, their patarialanes, the household spirits, household deities, I should say. And oftentimes those were seen as the figureheads or the genius loci of the family. And oftentimes they were also the founders of those families. So in an ancestral sense, that was a direct ancestor veneration. I think there's been enough evidence to show that the Roman household deities eventually evolved into the very regional forms of household spirits. And so when you think of like in Scotland, the Brunies, or the house deities, the house spirits, oftentimes in some cultures, quite a few cultures actually, they're conceptualized as forefathers. In the Russian context or the Slavic context, the figure of the domovoi or the kikimora, the domovichka, those are often talked about as grandfather or father of the household, and are then often seen as being the founders of those homesteads, those places. So, are those spirits ancestors, and so on, right? I know in the Irish context, I believe it was David Halpin who runs Circle Stories, and forgive me, I don't know him very well. I hope I'm not mischaracterizing his work, but I know that he's done a lot of work around the idea of the fairies, the Sidhe, as being somehow connected. And I know that that is also a contentious issue, so I'm not going to go too deeply into that because I don't want to either mischaracterize or talk out of my ass about things I don't really know. But as a bridging point, I know that conversation has been happening. So this idea then of kind of the other individual as humans changing into other and becoming then the figureheads or foreheads of groups. That relates then to this idea of mythological ancestors. These I really find fascinating myself. So if you look at particularly in medieval and classical world, we often find a lot of stories of particular communities either deriving descent from mythological beings or being suggested that they have as forebears these mythological. In England and Wales, we tend to have a lot of fairy stories like that. In Wales, where I'm from, we have the Lady of the Lake, Llynfach, which is a very typical fairy story. Fairy woman's captured by a human, is forced to marry him. She has children with him, and she lives happily with him, or sometimes unhappily with him, for a while until he breaks a certain vow, which is don't strike me, don't strike me, don't strike me. And eventually he taps her on the shoulder, or he grabs her or something. And she is then released from her marriage, released from her bonds, and she goes back to her fairy realm. But this is after the family has been established. So the physicians of Musfai, which is a very famous dynasty of physicians for the princes of Wales, derived descent from those individuals, from that fairy. I know up and down the western coast of Ireland and Scotland, you often find this too. Certain communities or certain families being said to be the descendants of Merrows or Selkies, the mermaids or the seal folk, and that accounts for why perhaps they have sometimes a little bit of webbed feet or webbed hands, why they are very, very good at being fishermen, or why they seem to be flourishing. You often find this also with certain regions of cattle. So the Isle of Skye up in Scotland there is said to have the creamiest milk because Highland cattle are descended from fairy cattle. We often also hear that of Welsh cattle as well, especially in North Wales. So this idea then of mythological ancestors, so what does that do then? And that relates to our connections with story, our connections of identity, and on a folk level, understanding it's about origins, right? But then what are we, or how are we relating to those individuals that are said to be descended from us, right? We find this often in ancient paganism. The Romans were very, very, very clear on this. They understood, a lot of them understood themselves, particularly the high nobility, Julius Caesar, as, for example, as being descended from deities. The ancient Egyptians really excelled at this too. Many of their rulers were said to be the sons of deities and whatnot. The figure of a demigod was very popular as founding figure in ancient Greece, and so you see this throughout. Obviously, also in British, Welsh, and Irish sagas and we often find demigods, and so then those figures who are the ancestors of those individuals. Sometimes those figures are deities, sometimes they're not, but they're still ancestral. So it becomes a very interesting kind of approach. It becomes a continuum then, as opposed to set guidelines of how we define them. In another vein of that, then, kind of switching gears a little bit, then, so this idea of fictional or conceptual ancestors. I really love this one as well, because it gets to that definition that I was talking about of a relationship to a being or a figure that impacts who we are, contributes to who we are in some ways. And I talked a lot about this in the book. About when we're young and we have a relationship with a fictional character that we can relate to and who seems to follow us throughout our lives. I certainly have those figures myself. I think if I were to ask everyone in this group, they could think of individuals or figures in their lives who they looked up to, whether those were humans, whether those were fictional characters, whether they were other forms of story, other figures from story, and how then they relate to those individuals and how those individuals and their stories have inspired your story. Are they ancestral? If so, how can you relate to them? And so on and so on. Some of the other pieces here, this is where the idea of expanding your idea of ancestor or where ancestral work begins to bleed into other forms of spiritual work. The idea of how do you work with your dead pets. The reality is that, if you have a pet, chances are you will outlive that pet, right? Unless you get a parrot who lives for hundreds of years, but that's a whole other issue. How do you honor them? If they're not ancestral to you, but they're also not a spirit, like what do you do? How do you honor them, right? But if they're part of your family, the idea of chosen family becomes a big thing too. And that's then gets into this idea of, ancestors by group, ancestors by adopted. Those individuals, and I certainly have, I'm sure many of you here have pets who you have lost. They're part of your family and you adopted them. Are they part of your ancestral work? Can they be included in your ancestral work, right? Another piece, beloved friends, beloved individuals that we've lost, or even our spirit guides. And this is an interesting one that comes up in some spiritual traditions. This idea of then, okay, on a practical level, how are we relating to different types of categories of being? And in particular, spirit guides is an interesting one. One of the traditions I belong to is Espiritismo. So it's the Caribbean form of French Spiritism. And in Spiritism, Kardecian Spiritism, unlike spiritualism that you would find with the Fox sisters, Spiritism would posit that spirit guides as a kind of a form of professional ethics. They have to not be related to you by ancestry, because if they're related to you in that ancestry, it's almost like having a modern counselor or a modern therapist. You can't have dual roles. You have to have a clean, if you're going to have a spirit guide and they're going to be assisting you throughout your life, then you need to have a non-dual relationship with them so that they can focus on what they need to do without being muddied by a possible agenda. And oftentimes those sorts of discussions happen within traditions. So it's an interesting piece there. I am conscious of time. We need to keep moving forward, but I think that's a really interesting part of the discussion. So let's talk then about some of the other points to consider. All of these are found in my book and expanded upon in the book a lot more. So we have then, so working with different types of ancestors, as I said, Another key piece that comes up again and again is how do you work with complicated or unhealthy ancestors? And again, that comes down to in what way does the tradition deal with those individuals? Oftentimes in community ancestor traditions that are passed down within the family and the extended family, there are mechanisms built in that will prevent unhealthy individuals from causing harm. Oftentimes in, like, for example, Chinese tradition, the ancestors have spokespeople who stand. Those are usually the founders of the family. So when you go to your ancestral shrine, you might have images of important ancestors as well, but you direct your attention to great-great-grandmother, great-great-grandfather, and they will then disseminate the blessings or to the other members of the family. They also hold court and they control. And that control piece from the other side then mitigates any of the unhealthy parts of the family from causing harm. That's a much bigger discussion, much broader than we can go into today, but that is something to think about, and that is something that is often thought about. That's one of the most common things that come up in questions. Another key piece here is then the sharing of traditions with others and the community. As individuals who are, I would suspect, on a Druid path by yourself, who are interested in, who are practicing your own spiritual path, may have come from a different tradition, from birth tradition, and are no longer practicing that. This then becomes the big question of, well, you've developed your ancestral practice. Then how are you going to share that with members of your family or members of your community? And so this is, I think, one of the bigger points to consider then is, as you are developing your own practices, how are you going to proliferate those practices? Are you even going to proliferate these practices? Is this more of a vehicle for your relationship with your ancestors as somebody who is on their own spiritual path, right? Another piece of this then is what your role is in the veneration. One half, I've a book to show you, but I think it's my bag in the corner there. My book is in two parts. One is worldview, really exploring worldview and how to conceptualize ancestral veneration. The other half is on the practical, lived, ritualistic practice. And so the one has to be informed by the other. You can't just do spiritual practice. I'm sure you know this from your Druidic work. Doing spiritual practice, doing ritual without necessarily understanding either the meaning or the meaningful impact of it is not going to lead anywhere. It doesn't make any sense, right? So thinking then about who you are in that relationship, if you're building your spiritual practice, if you're building your ancestral practice, who are you in that? And how are you relating to what you're doing? And then how are you relating to those on the receiving end of that work? So that really underlines the idea that ancestor work is a lived spiritual practice. And it's not just a form of magic. I was on a podcast a couple of days ago, and we were talking about ancestral magic. And I kept making the point that, we often, at least in the witchcraft community, we often tend to see spirituality as magic and magic as doing something, right? Gaining some sort of a goal, which is the definition of magic. Magic is the performance in order to attain a goal of a ritual practice. But if you're in a relationship, if ancestor work is really about a relationship with ancestors, not necessarily about doing something like magic or whatnot, and the doingness is connected to then facilitating that communication, then you're missing out if you're only approaching the ancestors in order for them to get to do something for you. And so then it becomes a lived part of your lifestyle. That's when it becomes less about just a spiritual practice and more about a lifestyle, right? Including the ancestors in your life. A couple of other pieces here. So, as I said before, there's a difference between mourning versus veneration. Mourning is about the social loss and the individual emotional loss of an individual within our social sphere. Veneration is understanding that that individual is not gone, but they have changed, and so there's a big difference there. There's a piece around the morality of ancestor veneration, and I love this one in particular. So on the right hand side here, we have Confucius, who is a powerhouse in Chinese culture and one of the major figures of Chinese philosophy. And Confucius was very interested in the harmony of society through and the morality of society through the continuation of tradition. And he particularly was fond of ancestor veneration because he saw it as a foundational building block for teaching individuals how to behave in society. And he said something along I'm paraphrasing here, but he said something along the lines of ancestor veneration is a moral exercise because in teaching individuals how to take care of the needs of the intangible, they are more prone to then learn how to successfully take care of the needs of the tangible, of the living. If you can learn how to take care through the ritual of things you can't see, then you'll be more prone to understanding and being a good member of society, because you'll already have those skills. And I love that piece. And that's the piece, I think, that really underscores ancestor work around the world, is that it isn't about the living, it's about the dead. We take care of the dead, we provide the dead with what they need for their afterlives, and in that they support with this expanded view and their expanded powers, with the understanding that we will eventually be one of them. So our descendants are supporting us and going to support us. So learning and teaching ancestor work down the generations is really instilling in the next generation that their role then is to take care of us as we become ancestors. And in that, there's a responsibility of passing down a good world for the nation, right? That piece around legacy. There's a difference between general veneration versus specific veneration. General veneration is a general worldview of including the ancestors in your life, whereas specific veneration then is the individual practices, the specific meaningful things that we do, which could include putting down food for them on a regular basis, creating a shrine to work with them through, remembering and passing down and continuing the stories connected to them, and so on. So there's those components there, and of course that's inclusive of all spiritual tradition, right? There's some reasons then to engage with the ancestors. Veneration for propitiation. You're looking for their blessings. This one you don't necessarily see in the West too much, but it is a very realistic thing around the world. It's veneration to prevent calamity. That idea of appeasing the ancestors to make sure that they don't somehow hurt you because of various reasons. Now, this becomes a worldview thing. If you see the dead as being potentially dangerous or not, most traditions would, because the process of going through death can be very traumatic. And I mean, if we were to take this from a more human point of view, how many jokes are made about family causing issues for adult children because suddenly the power dynamics have shifted. It's there's that movie, National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation. I'm not sure, that might not be as well known in Europe as it is in North America, but imagine Christmas and all of your relatives suddenly show up and they get stranded at your house because of a blizzard. And you then have to deal in your own home with all of the various family dramas that would normally not be as bad, right? In like an enclosed space, right? That is perhaps sometimes ancestral veneration, is learning to mediate between different big egos, right? So we venerate and practice to prevent that calamity. And also veneration for proliferation of the community. the ancestor veneration traditions become a container for all other parts of community, and that then is proliferate. Include new members in that tradition who then pass those traditions down, and so on and so on. Another piece here, and this is a really powerful one, is veneration as social activism. So we're starting to see now that people are swinging back, especially in the West, to, and especially among marginalized communities, to practicing and taking up again the folk tradition, ancestor veneration included. You see this particularly in North America with BIPOC individuals, so Black and Indigenous people of color. Those communities are reclaiming their identities that were taken away from them because of colonialism. And we see this also in the British Isles and Irish Isles, right? In particular in like Wales, where I'm from, right? The emphasis of language, reclaiming language, and saving the Welsh language. And I understand in Ireland it's the same thing with Irish. It isn't just about language, it's about culture, it's about identity, it's about community. And part of that proliferation is also in taking up the social contexts that those languages existed within. So a lot of interest, my friend Mara Starling, who writes on Welsh witchcraft, a lot of interest in her book by people in the diaspora, because they not only want to save their own culture, but they want to find an expression of self within that culture, right? So social activism is a very powerful thing when it comes to this, and one that I particularly love. So we've talked a great deal about some of the individual experiences already. So I'll briefly go over this. So again, deeper relationship to one's own story. There's that element of personal morality. You're finding yourself and you're finding your role in society. There's that supporting of family and supporting of self, right? And I think that framework to work with personal grief is also really important. Some of my research that I did was in particular communities that were very different from the Western context. One of those communities was the Sadan Tarahan people in Sulawesi. Now, Sulawesi is the flower-shaped island that exists right in the middle of Indonesia, Malaysia. And these Tarahan people, they're a very large population. I think there's something like 500,000 of them, or close to 1 million of them. And in that, they come from an animistic tradition. 100 years ago, they were mostly converted to Dutch Protestant Christianity, but they retained a lot of their traditional practices. And one of those is their practice around the dead. And it takes a long time for them to have funerals because they have very elaborate funeral rituals that need to be performed depending upon the status that you hold in society. And so it can sometimes take up to 20 years to be able to hold a funeral, because you have to buy in sacrifices. There's a mass bull sacrifice. There's a giant gathering of the community, a giant feast put on by the community. And all of that is in order to propel the individual into the afterlife and into the world of the ancestors. So part of that tradition is holding and keeping the body at home. And the understanding is that while the person may not be animate, they are still alive. The spirit of the individual is still in the body, even if the body is not moving anymore. And so oftentimes they will build, or they will keep the body in the house. Of course, they'll prepare it so that it doesn't decompose and all the other. And they will treat the spirit inside as though they're still living. They will still offer that individual food. They will still talk to that individual and visit with that individual, tell that individual what their lives are like, even if they are up in the room. They will talk of that individual as being ill, being up, grandfather is ill, so don't be so loud, or grandmother is taking a nap, right? Often that image of sleeping is huge. So one of the women who were interviewed by a company, I think it was like BBC South Asia or something like that, She was talking about how, it may sound strange to Westerners to see that, but she said, for us, it's I think it helps us to deal with grief because it gives us such a long time to say goodbye, and so the whole movie was on the funeral of her father, and he had passed away something like 7 years before, and she had treated his body, and it just became a lifestyle piece of having her father's body in the house. And you could see that even after 7 years, when the funeral took place, and there was a particular moment when the understanding is now the spirit is released. He's no longer in that body anymore, and he's gone. The grief that came over this woman. And she said, having 7 years with him to say goodbye, ease into not having him in my life, it made a difference. So that idea of the individual experience of facilitating a framework to work with personal grief is huge. Like I said, in that example, we talked about it creates a dynamic of personal routine. It just became a lifestyle piece for her, that she would offer him food, that she would speak to him, and relate to him in a different way now, right? And it just became her life. We talked about this connecting individual to personal supernatural resources. So that idea of propitiating, the idea that these individuals now have expanded reigns of power, that they have different abilities now that they're past. And I think this is the most important one as an individual experience. It centers death as a natural part of life. Ancestor work and centers death as a natural part of life. Something that I think in the West, we need to learn a lot more about, because for so many of us, so many of our communities, death is not something that we see regularly. Right? Death is something that happens, but what happens when somebody dies? The coroner comes, takes the body away, and the next time you see it, they're either cremated already or they're backlit with makeup on and they look like they're sleeping. Right? The unnaturalness of the modern funerary industry, huge. So I think connecting with ancestors also makes it a part of our lives. It brings death back into the focus, but it also changes how we conceive death, because death then is no longer just a state of being. It's the momentary transition between states of being. That's how I at least have come to it. Let's talk about social experience then. So again, it helps to strengthen social bonds. It forms structures of community expression, right? So history, identity, culture. It creates a nexus point of engagement, as I was saying, and it forms for the community a place of bonding because of that. Again, it is highly specific to tribe community, and it has to be, because ancestor work is relationships between groups that are familial, are family, are related, right? And this, I think, is where I think we tend to lose focus in neo-paganism and in witchcraft, because for many of us, those are very individual and isolated paths. Most of us strike out on a spiritual journey for us, and not necessarily because we're part of a community already. Although that is changing, and beautiful communities like yours, and if any of you were at the EXA event on the weekend, OBOD and other groups have come together and formed. But for the most part, I would say most of us strike out on our own to begin with, because of either religious trauma or because the traditions of our families, they don't give us what we're feeling like we need. And so then that becomes I would say that becomes a problem for ancestor work, because we then don't necessarily know how to relate to our ancestral traditions. And I talk about that weird dichotomy in the book. Now, don't come for me, don't send me hate mail if you disagree with me on that. That's just my opinion. And I expand on that in the book more. This piece around, again, that social experience of kind of ancestor work in general, it's educating and initiating younger members of the community into group norms, rules, and values. So although the emphasis might be on the ancestors and what they do, then we start to see the blurring of the lines and the merging into folk practice, cultural practice, and it becomes integrated. And the last piece here allows community to express specific spiritual needs that dominant religion cannot. This is where we see folk religion and folk traditions forming to cater to the specific needs of those individual communities. Okay. Another piece here connected to that is, again, the idea of ancestor work as a parallel tradition nestled within larger state or official religions. And oftentimes it can be a fully fledged spiritual practice all by itself. You see this dichotomy then. Certain parts of the culture are then designated as official religions, certain parts of the culture become connected to ancestor work, which is really spirit work, and so then we see that divergence, and the two then will practice and exist next to each other. Oftentimes, sometimes crossing paths, sometimes just flowing without cognitive dissonance and without paradox. And that piece here around the nature of the ancestors is we are working with beings who may or may not have practiced our traditions. And so we need to be malleable. This idea of parallel tradition, I think, is not something that we are raised to understand in the Western world, because we tend to be very focused on this is the tradition, this is the practice. But syncretic practice and parallel traditions is a norm around the world. And oftentimes we just need to be malleable then, and in thinking and conceptualizing and how we understand our worldview. That's why one half of my book is about worldview and understanding that worldview. So then that brings us then to kind of challenging that idea of worldview then. And let's talk about the patroness, the matron, however you want to frame that, of your grove. So here we have a beautiful image of the Paps of Anu. At least I really hope that is a picture of the Paps of Anu. If that isn't, please tell me, because I don't want to be a fool of myself. But in thinking then of Anu as a mother goddess, and mother goddesses in general, why do we conceptualize them as goddesses and not ancestors, even if they take on similar roles? We often personify the land, the sea, and the sky, and there's reasons for that. There's solid reasons for that. But if we were to just take a step back for a second, there's multiple things that's happening here. The land, the sea, and the sky are literally where our species came from. Our precursor ancestors evolved in the sea. When we are born, the physicality of our bodies are made using the land. We emerge from the land, right? All of the food that we eat is grown in the land. And so we are a product of the land, right? This idea of the sky, all of the molecules that exist in our bodies, the water that is flowing through our bodies, originated in space, originated in the sky. And so the sky, the land, the sea, all of these worldly cosmological spaces are ancestral if we see them that way. And so then that becomes the question, well, how do we relate to these geological figures, these spaces? How do we relate to the idea of Mother Earth in an ancestral way? How does that idea of ancestor then get in the way of relating, if we only see ancestor as being a particular thing of blood? So I think as Druids and coming to the world, that sense of nature worship then, and particularly animism, and I really strongly connect with that worldview of animism, then what are the lines that form and how do they get in the way? How can we relate? And in that way, then what does that mean for our relationships with other things in the space, those other beings in the space who are also children of Mother Earth or children of the sky, or who also evolved in the sea? right? How do we relate to our siblings and our cousins of other species? And what does that say about how then we relate to each other and ourselves, right? I think that I'm going to leave that as a question for you. And we're coming up to the end of this presentation. We'll certainly we'll have a question and answer period just afterwards. I do want to plug my book though, because that's why I'm here. But I do want to pay respects to some of my ancestors and the book's ancestors here, and some of the figures that have helped to create our community. And so these are some of the words that our chosen chief, Emma Burke, Philip Cargom, and Professor Ronald Hutton have said about my book. I was really, really, really honored for them to say these things. And I'm really, really pleased that they also read it and gave their personal opinions on it. The book Ancestral Whispers, A Guide to Building Ancestral Veneration Practices, is out in North America on September 8th, and it's coming out on I believe the 8th of October in Europe and other places around the world. If you're interested in checking out the book, you can actually go to llewellyn.com, and on there you can see the first couple of chapters for free. You can also see the table of contents, and you can also pre-order through them. If you're in the United States, you can pre-order through them. Otherwise, you can pick up the book or order the book through Amazon, through Waterstones, through any of the other big booksellers over there, and it is available also in Kindle format as well. So you can both get the physical copy or the Kindle format. And so if you're interested in learning more about me or following my work, I do have other offerings as well. In the fall coming up, I have quite a lot of classes planned and things like that. I also have a lot of content. I have a podcast as well, and I have been using the podcast to have some amazing chats. I will say for the OBOD folks here, if you don't know about my podcast, I try not to flood the OBOD page with it, but in the past I've chatted to David Barrett. I have Christopher Hughes coming up is it this week or next week? And so I was very, very pleased that he was able to meet with me. I also have a load of traditional witchcraft and folkloric witchcraft folk. Morgan Daimler, and I hope most of you know who Morgan Daimler is, and if you don't, check them out. They are a writer for moon books based in I believe the Boston area, of Road, Connecticut area in the United States. They do a lot of work with Laura O'Brien, part of the Irish pagan school, and they have a ton of work on Irish tradition and Irish fairies, and I think most of them. I think most of you should know who Morgan is, and I've spoken to her multiple times. Also, Mara Starling and a couple of other people. So check out my pages here, and that brings us to the end of that. So I'm going to stop sharing here. Let's just see. Nope. Stop sharing and bring us all back.
Brilliant, Ben. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hang on.
Yeah.
I'll pin ourselves here.
Yeah.
Karen here next to me.
Hello, Karen.
we both really enjoyed the show. Enjoyed your lecture. I don't know. Do you have some time for additional questions? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes.
There's one in the chat for you. That was from YouTube. I think that's the one we can do first. It's a long waiting question. Can you recommend a way to venerate without condoning those ancestors, blood ancestors, whose actions or beliefs are exactly or aren't exactly savory to our current societal or personal beliefs?
Absolutely. This is a very common question. This is something that is brought up a lot, and it's something that I think our Western world has not prepared us to answer fully. And right now, we're in a time and space where we're discovering a lot about our ancestors that we don't find acceptable, that we aren't interested in, and we're not interested in condoning. So there's multiple ways to approach this, and I try to be cautious because there's I could easily be misinterpreted here, but I think it depends upon where you're coming from. So this comes back to this idea of worldview. So if you are seeing yourself as a line of descent from those individuals, then I think that there's a piece about responsibility here. But if you're seeing yourself as separate from those individuals and you're not interested in even going into that, there's also danger in that too. In North America, where I'm currently living, they're really dealing with this right now. And I would say also modern Britain is also very much dealing with this right now. That idea that on a social level and on an individual level, harm has been done in the past. I speak from personal experience as somebody who is literally the product of colonialism. 150 years ago, the various ancestors of my family line are from Scotland, Ireland, Wales, England, and Cornwall, right? They all met in Manchester and the Midlands area, right? If they didn't do that, I wouldn't be here, right? But they met because of various social issues that were happening back then. Right? My Irish family came over to England because there was no work in Ireland, and there's a lot of trauma connected that then showed up later in the 1950s with my grandparents. So what would I do with that information if I felt, and I did feel very uncomfortable reading about that and understanding that I'm the product of that history, right? I think that there's many ways to approach it. I think it depends on the context of it. But I would err on the idea that learning as much about it as you can, even though it's uncomfortable, is the very first step. We go into shadow work with that, right? And I would approach it from the shadow work perspective. Because of our discomfort, where is that discomfort coming from? Is that discomfort coming from disgust? Right? In which case, then, how can we then take that and transmute that into holding accountable? Right? We're looking at then giving that responsibility to that ancestor and holding them accountable. Another piece then is, are we feeling disgust because actually we're then products of a family story that is then making that individual the scapegoat of the family? So again, I think it depends on what the issue is, right? If you're coming from a place of family shame because you suddenly discover that your great-great-grandfather was homosexual and you don't like that because that's really not fitting in with what you're feeling, then where's that family shame, and how is that then family shame going to be perpetuated down there? What pressures are you putting on yourself? I was chatting to somebody a couple of days ago on a podcast who was talking about how one of his ancestors, who was a bigger name in North American history, came over on the Mayflower and is part of that real first Puritan kind of approach. He was saying how he discovered that, like, the family story was they were good Puritans, they would never have slaves. How could you possibly have slaves? They were good Christians. Turns out he was a slaveholder. What do we do with that? What do we do with that? And a lot of people in the south of the United States are dealing with that question of then, okay, well, what do I do with that? And I would say that the answer is to understand it, because in understanding it fully, it means then you can understand how that context created the context you live in now. And in then understanding that context, you can figure out, okay, what has been passed down through generations to now? What are the privileges on a social level? What are the privileges that you have been given because of that context back there? And how is that then creating an unfair situation for somebody else in society? Now, I suspect that this question is actually coming from something else, which is, what if you discover ancestor is a pedophile or was a murderer or something like that, right? On a more personal family level. And that's where I think it comes to then the ancestor veneration is it isn't necessarily your responsibility of working with that person. But then that's where the collective family comes in, right? You know, if you discover that there is an individual that you don't feel comfortable working with because you just can't stomach something that they did, the two things that I think are intersecting there. One, you're focusing on that one individual. Go to their elders, go to the other parts of the family, go to the collective and look at the collective story of the family as opposed to that individual. But also understand how that individual fits into your own life now. If that individual was a murderer, a slaveholder, all of this, and you live with privilege in your life now that originated from that individual, then figure out then how then can you use the privilege that you were given from very uneasy, seedy means to then help society? How can you take what you've been given and use it as a tool for better, fits with your own feelings and your own values, right? I think the other piece to that is, in particular, that idea of then how do you relate to what that individual is representing? What trauma is coming to you? This is particularly hard for anybody who has endured sexual abuse, especially as a child, right? How are they going to deal with a family member who did that to them in an ancestral way? How, bridging out from that, I think this is on a more general level. How are we going to deal with ancestors who were Christians in life when the Christian church of any variety hurt us as individuals? I think neo-paganism, that's the big piece right there. How do I relate to ancestors who hold the worldview of this thing that has hurt me in my life? And so then that's the journey of understanding those as individuals versus those as figureheads or kind of symbols of that pain, right? You know, my great-great-grandmother, or my great-great-grandfather, I should say, was a Methodist preacher. Methodism has not been kind to gay people. I'm a gay person myself. How do I relate to that individual not as a symbol of Methodism, which is being so rampantly toxic, and see them then as an individual? So there's multiple pieces to that, and I hope I did a good I hope I did a good job complicating that. I talk a great deal of that in the book, but I think bring it back to yourself. And also that other piece underlying this is you don't have to take responsibility for anything that doesn't make you feel uncomfortable, that makes you uncomfortable. But it is your responsibility to uncover for yourself where that discomfort is coming from and do your work around that.
Okay, brilliant.
That's how it's fun. Okay.
Yeah, look in the chat. Maybe you'll find something.
So thank you, Ross, for that. Thank you. So there's multiple questions from Ross here. I'm just going to skim and take a couple of them here. How society do you think we are coming full circle in regard to learning about our origins as a species? Well, I mean, there is that Netflix show about the Homo naledi that just came out, and I think we're still trying to figure out our origins as species. I think we need to understand our origins both as individuals and as collectives. I think we need to come back into relationship with ourselves as a collective, because I think the scourge of Western society is individualism and capitalism, and that is not a natural thing around the world. Capitalism run rampant is really individualism run rampant, and when you see your needs and your goals as being more important than anybody else, then we get into situations like Trump, for example, right? So I think the origins of our species is really to understand ourselves as a species in a group, right? So thank you, Eric, for that. Thank you. And then coming from you mentioned the precursor species. Oh, perfect. Wonderful. Okay. Does anybody else have any questions that they wanted to ask?
Yeah. So unmute yourself and ask if you like in the Zoom then. Yeah, I have a small question myself. I received from a family member a list of 24 generations, dating back to the late 13th century. Of course, these are people that are so different because they're from very different times, and then how deep can you connect with your biological ancestors? What's normal, healthy?
Of course. So, well, it comes back to the idea of story, right? So we live in a context that was created from the contexts before it, right? And I think the interesting thing with genealogy, and people get so wrapped up in knowing their particular family line, eventually, once you get back to so many generations, like if you go back, I think it's 8 generations. If you go back 8 generations, you suddenly have like 50,000 ancestors in that one line, right? It compounds every single time you go back. And eventually it just gets ridiculous. Like if you go back 1,000 years, you have a quadrillion ancestors, more people than could ever have been existed in that place, right? So what eventually happens is your individual family story begins to become the community story, because by that time you have so many ancestors are around. By the time you get to certain other generations, the whole kingdom, the whole region, the whole continent is suddenly, you have so many ancestors in that place that the whole history of that place becomes your family history. And in a social way, it then generates our society now. So like as a classicist, as somebody who's studying medieval studies and history, I can tell you that the way we think about the world is very medieval, because we're constantly always looking back to authority based on history, right? The longer and older something is, the more authoritative it is, right? So I think if we look at our society now and just understanding our society now as being a product of the past, we can relate to our ancestors. The majority, coming back to a species biology thing, we often think of people in the past as being dumb because they don't have the same, understanding of the world as we do. They have the same brain. Like 100,000 years ago, those early humans are anatomically the same as us. And so they have the same ability to reason. All logic is the ability to reason based upon certain information. So they were logically looking at the world and saying, okay, the sun god rises in the east and sets in the west, and that's part of the cosmology. So we're going to worship the sun god. Very logical, right? So I think to work with the ancestors in that way, and biological ancestors, is to understand that eventually your story merges with the story of everybody else's. In the same way that our story now, our social story now, in 500 years' time, our descendants in 500 years' time, if we're all still here, if that's hopefully the human species is still around, your story is going to be connected to 100,000 other people living right now that you don't know, but you're going to be sharing those descendants with those individuals. So it becomes a web, right? And I think for me, when I started to think of ancestors in that way, then it began to, okay, legacy is a huge piece. There's understanding the legacy that we live in now of our ancestors. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense.
It does. It does.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well,
yeah.
the list I have is a fraternal line, so it's always the father of the father of the father. So it's just 24 men and 24 women.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, so that's beautiful. And there's professions there and where they lived. So it's a lovely list, and I'm blessed to have received it.
It's wonderful.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, go on. Oh, I was going to say my auntie or my dad's cousin in Lancashire in England did our line in that way, and she went back, I think, to the 1800s, and it's fascinating to then see some of the patterns that come up again and again and again. Right? It's very interesting to see how, even though the centuries change, the same story reasserts itself again and again. Right? What's Paul? Hi, Paul. In an Irish context, there's whole other layers when religion trembles and ethnic markers. Exactly, yes. And good night, Sarah. Thank you for joining us. Okay. I'm not seeing any other questions. If there are no other questions,
I don't see anyone unmuting themselves. So if you have a question, it's that you want to pose, now's the time, Karen.
No, not at the moment.
Okay, well,
just waiting. Yeah.
we're 1 hour and 40 minutes in, so we did we did a marvelous job, I think, Ben. For me, it's a very big thank you for showing up here and for this lovely presentation, which was also nicely watched on YouTube. And we'll leave it over there for the rest of the world to read more, know more about it. We are definitely going to order your book, and I'm going to give it a beautiful review in the Pagan Island magazine, where both Karen and I regularly review books in. So, and I'm very anxious in reading more about this work, and it's a very interesting topic, and especially the broad scope you opened up for us tonight, the fictional characters, like I regard Arthur and Merlin. I'm a great fan of the Arthurian legends as my spiritual ancestors, and they found their place now in this lecture. Maybe one last question: a living tree, like an ancient old, we have in Muckross Abbey here, 100 years old yew tree or an old oak tree, but they're still alive. So is there? How do you see that? Is there ancestry there?
I would say again that figures like that, especially yew trees, there's reasons why like churches in so many places are built on with ancient trees like that. They become axis mundi. They become consistent places that the community can come around, right? And it's fascinating how many trees and ancient trees particularly become the centers of communities. And they become like those immortal characters that are always there. They become the touchstones that the community can gather around and connect with and relate to, right? And I think in some ways they become ancestral to many of us. And many of them were planted by our ancestors, whether we know it or not, right? And so they become those guardians watching over the generations of their original friends, and we can relate to them in that way. Yes, they may have been planted by our, 10th great grandfather back in the day, but we can have the friendship with them too, right? Yeah.
Well, brilliant, lovely ending to a lovely story. Thank you so much, and again,
thank you so much, everybody.
Hope to hear more of you in the future.
Thank you. Yes, I plan on actually. Paul has invited me to exit, so I'm hoping to get over there. Otherwise, Glastonbury at some point, if people are visiting there, I'm hoping to go to that one next year. Well, not next year, the year after. But I'll be around.